Welcome everybody to Scottish Independence Podcasts. This is a bit of a new venture for us because we're trying out a new format called Libby's Minis, although that title might change. The idea is we're going to do shorter, simpler topics that we maybe want to give you an update on, or something that we think is worth discussing, or an interview that we've done, something that we think would be of interest. And we're also going to drop the video version of the discussion into our YouTube channel, Intercode Extra.
Yeah.
Welcome. I'm here with my co-host Marlene. What we thought we would talk about in this Libby's Mini is land reform. We did a whole episode on land reform. We'll put the link in the notes underneath this podcast. We did a whole episode on land reform, and one of the two main case studies that we looked at, as well as having a trip to Loch Lomond and a tour on the boat, we looked at the Flamingo Park application, which at that time the planning permission was denied because it was the most objected to planning application ever. And they had said they weren't going to proceed if the public weren't behind them. The public clearly weren't behind them, and yet they've come back with another application. So the first thing we thought we would share is Ross Greer from the Scottish Greens had a private members' business debate where he gave an update of what had happened and where we'd got to with it. So we'll play that. It's about 8 minutes worth of Ross explaining.
There have been some major developments in this saga since that point, though, most notably a major revision to Flamingo Land's application, which I'll come to in a moment. Firstly, though, I hope colleagues will indulge me in providing a brief history of how the last 7 years have led us to this point. And it has been a 7-year process. I'd highlight that number to emphasise just how exhausting this has been for the local community, who've now had this threat hanging over them for the best part of a decade. Flamingo Land's first formal application was lodged and dealt with 4 years ago. The application was for a tourist resort on a massive scale, sitting on the banks of Loch Lomond at Balloch on what is currently largely publicly owned land. The plans included 125 woodland lodges, largely to be situated in the ancient woodland at Drumkinnon Woods, as well as a hotel, a water park, a monorail and more. Iconic lochside views were to be interrupted by buildings that local residents quite fairly described as garish. And publicly owned land was to be used to generate profits for a private company based hundreds of miles away in Yorkshire, and which certainly would not be reinvesting it in the local community and economy. Flamingo Land's own environmental impact assessment made for particularly grim reading, speaking of, amongst other things, damage to ancient woodland, pollution of standing and running water, red squirrel and otter fatalities, and a host of other environmental concerns. That was from their own documentation. As you may recall, local residents and I formed the Save Loch Lomond campaign, through which we lodged over 60,000 objections. This made Flamingo Land the most unpopular planning application in Scottish history. We were joined in objecting by the Woodland Trust, Ramblers Scotland and West Dunbartonshire Council. The application was so clearly contrary to local and national planning policy that the National Park's own planning officers recommended that their board reject it. Rather than face that loss, Flamingo Land withdrew their application with just days to go before the hearing. That was in 2019. We knew that they would come back, so it was no surprise that a fresh application was lodged last year. That application was for 127 lodges, 2 hotels, a water park, a monorail, up to 21 apartments, a brewery, a pub, a restaurant, a boathouse, and all to be served by 393 parking spaces. They tried to squeeze almost as much in as they did the first time, but into a smaller space. They told us that the ancient woodland at Drumkinnon Wood had been taken out of the application and lodges moved elsewhere on the site. But any suspicions that Flamingo Land had turned into tree huggers thanks to our influence were short-lived. The details of the plans still showed that an area of Drumkinnon Wood, marked in the application as Area 10, was earmarked for destruction, as were sections of ancient woodland alongside Woodbank House and the proposed boathouse. But even the supposedly saved bulk of Drumkinnon Wood may be endangered by these plans. They're currently under the ownership of Scottish Enterprise, a public body. Should planning permission be granted for the site, Flamingo Land get the woods too. When they were still speaking to me, that's some time ago, Flamingo Land told me that the economic viability of the site rested on being able to develop in the ancient woodland. It's hard to believe that should they take ownership of the woods, or even a long-term lease, that they wouldn't seek at some point to exploit them for financial benefit. Last year's plans were seriously flawed, left so many questions unanswered, and made a number of contradictory claims. So on my behalf, the planning and environmental law expert Ian Cowan submitted a detailed letter of objection flagging every one of these issues to the National Park. And in response, and for which I'm grateful, their planning department essentially put the process on hold, demanding that the developer resubmit a number of documents and respond to 16 requests on everything from clarification of contradictory statements on parking provision and ancient woodland laws to how the proposals could possibly meet the high bar set by National Planning Framework 4. And just 2 weeks ago, Flamingo Land responded, so this is a timely debate. They've reduced the number of lodges planned to 104 and parking spaces to 372 to allow for the staff and service area to be relocated from Area 10, the bit of ancient woodland. This is welcome, and I want to congratulate the local residents who worked really hard to protect that bit of Drumkinnon Wood. But the ancient woodland isn't safe from sell-off, and as described by the Woodland Trust's briefing circulated to MSPs, other sections of ancient woodland are still under threat. There are so many flaws in this third attempt at a proposal. It's still much bigger than the visitor experience space zoned in the National Parks planning policy. It would be a scar on a world-famous landscape. The Landscape and Visual Impact Assessment admits that there would be adverse effects. Flamingo Land keep telling us that there would be no negative impact on access, but that's simply impossible to achieve. You can't turn a popular public space for informal recreation into a densely packed, branded and privately owned holiday lodge park without a loss of the freedom to roam. A busy attraction with 372 parking spaces certainly isn't compatible with the park's net zero objectives or the Scottish Government's policy of reducing car usage. We're all well aware, too well aware, that Loch Lomond and its communities are overwhelmed by visitors travelling by car through peak tourist season. Speak to any resident of Luss or Balmaha or Balloch itself about the stress of dealing with everything from inconsiderate parking to genuinely dangerous driving and antisocial behaviour. We want people to enjoy Loch Lomond, but we must acknowledge that some of its communities are simply at breaking point. The last thing any of us would want is the kind of oversaturation of tourism leading to deep-seated hostility from residents, which destinations like Barcelona have experienced. The park are doing excellent work to make visiting the area more sustainable and supporting local residents who are struggling with the impact of high visitor numbers. I know the Minister won't be able to say much about a live planning application, and I recognise this isn't his portfolio area, but I would appreciate if he was able to speak a little bit more about the good work that the park is doing to encourage sustainable use. There's one other area about the National Park, the Park Authority, that I want to encourage the Minister and his colleague Orna Slater to look into. Normally with a controversial planning application, objectors would be able to contact their councillors directly and make their views heard. Even though councillors on the relevant committee, the planning committee, wouldn't be allowed to express an opinion on the plans, this feedback from residents is an important part of the process. So it's unfortunate that Loch Lomond in the Trossachs National Park is the exception here. Unlike any of the more than 500 other councils and national parks in the UK, this park doesn't publicise direct contact details for its board members. I know that many of my constituents want to address board members directly, and the fact that they have no means of doing so leaves an unacceptable democratic deficit. The views of the community in this particular case are certainly beyond a doubt. We've had 2 local surveys now showing opposition by a margin of around 3 to 1. Flamingo Land's chief executive said if the community didn't support them, they would walk away. And it's very, very clear that the community don't support them, and yet here we are again. Residents certainly don't trust Flamingo Land's grand claims. Not only would the substantial increase in traffic on already busy local roads clearly be to the detriment of the community, there's very little belief that the claimed economic benefits will actually materialise. Flamingo Land initially promised 300 jobs for the area. This number's plummeted as the years went on. The eventual impact assessment for the 2019 application stated the equivalent of just 28 net jobs would be created in the region, compared to Flamingo Land didn't go ahead. And of course, many of those would be seasonal. The community is not hostile to development. I would certainly welcome the redevelopment of Woodbank House, for example. But Flamingo Lands are too big, too destructive, and come from a developer whose behaviour should frankly disqualify them from playing a role in the life of our national park. The community are not short of alternative ideas for some of the sites, but these can't be taken forward for as long as Flamingo Land's exclusivity agreement is in place. Were that to be dropped, I think Scottish Enterprise would get a lot out of actually speaking to residents about what they want. And like in some cases in Drumkinnon Wood, for example, that would be for no development to take place. Much loved, well-used community green spaces are worth protecting, especially when they're also the gateway to our world-famous national park. In closing, Presiding Officer, 43,000 objections have been lodged to this latest application. The Woodland Trust and Ramblers Scotland have joined us in opposing it once again, and the National Trust for Scotland has now also come out against the plans. We are all motivated by a deep love for Loch Lomond and a passionate desire to protect it. We've beaten Flamingo Land at every turn for 7 years now, and we are ready to do so again one last time. We are going to save Loch Lomond.
What strikes me over and over again with these, planning permission escapades, because here we are. I mean, there's Ross again. He's back there. He's back encouraging people to write in, object, and again, it's the most heavily even the second go at it. It's still one of the most heavily objected to. I mean, tens of thousands of objections being put in, and it's just. It goes round and round, and you kind of think, well, hopefully it's the people who have the project that get tired first. But you can sort of see that it may well not be like that. It might be that it's the local planning, committee that gets a bit overwhelmed or just gives in somewhere. But it's just, why there can't just be a complete. This is not going to happen. Probably that's illegal. I mean, probably a planning application committee actually can't do that.
It's also, it's a national park, so you think we might be able to put some guidelines in and say, look, we don't want this kind of thing, we want that kind of thing. And I mean, it just shows you how much money is obviously at stake. Yeah. The fact they're not letting this go. Yeah. And I mean, the description that Ross gives in his thing about all the different things they're trying to cram in there, and they're still, they've got 300 parking spaces, and they've got boat rides, restaurants, this, that. I mean, huge number of different mini business ventures, totally out of keeping with the landscape. And what you go to Loch Lomond for, it's not to walk into a casino. It's to actually appreciate.
Is there a casino in it?
I don't. I'm saying that as an example of the kind of inappropriate stuff.
Right.
I don't think there was a casino listed.
That application was for 127 lodges, 2 hotels, a water park, a monorail, up to 21 apartments, a brewery, a pub, a restaurant, a boathouse, and all to be served by 393 parking spaces. I mean,
it was. I mean, that part of, the shoreline at Balloch, I mean, it was a sort of shopping mall. I mean, and it does need reinvigorated and and made to work, probably updated and made to work a bit better for what people want now. So fair enough. But for this to come in and I mean, even the name Flamingo Land, their brand name, and I feel myself as well. They can say what they like, but what it'll end up is looking like their other Flamingo Land centres, which is pretty crappy.
But I mean, it's for what it is. If you want a family holiday in a theme park with lots of bright lights and garish colours, it's perfect. I've been there when we went as kids to Flamingo Land. It was great, but it's not Loch Lomond.
It's not Loch Lomond.
No, it doesn't fit there.
It's not Loch Lomond. I mean, that day that you and I and a friend went out on the boat trip out onto Loch Lomond, it's just. I mean, it was a stunningly lovely day, but it's so beautiful, and then you turn, you kind of turn and look back to that bit of shoreline that would become Flamingo Land, and go, oh, don't do it. I mean, this is it's our land actually, and it's not, to let it be taken over by with that sort of project just seems to me to be irresponsible. But at the same time, I am sure that planning committees have their limits about what they can do. So that's when Scottish Government can get called in.
Yeah. And the other thing, I remember when we went that day, that we took photos of the paddle steamer that was just laid up rotting in the. I mean, that is a tragedy as well. And I suppose we can't say, give us the money, but we're not letting you put any of your businesses here. There's got to be some bit of...
well, I mean, I suppose one of the objections from Ross has always been the objection in principle, and then they added that very few people round about there would be able to afford to go and have a holiday in some of those cabins and that they're proposing to put in. It's certainly not going to be for the average income household.
And it wasn't, I think there are issues with the travel there, the idea of having so many more cars on what's already quite a narrow road, and, where's the additional investment in public transport maybe that would have eased some of that. So
we're not fans
We're not fans.
We're not fans. And I mean, it's interesting, going back, touching into that whole program that we did, because there were other projects that we talked about as well, wasn't there? There was the one up on Great Bernary.
Well, and there's actually been an update on that as well. Okay, so this article is actually the 23rd of March, so it's quite recent. So Bernera, again, we covered it as a case study in our maybe Zai episode about it, but just in the last couple of days, Alistair Allen, MSP, who's supporting their bid, has been asking for the land reform bill that's due this year to be strengthened when it comes to absentee landlords. And for anybody who doesn't remember our original show, it's a fascinating story. The island was originally bought by Robin de la Lanne Merlis, who was a fascinating character. Some think the inspiration for James Bond. He bought the island, lived on it actually, was part of the community. But then when he died in 2012, he left it to his grandson, Cyran de Lanne Merlis, who I think he lives in Switzerland. Absentee landlord, no interest in the place.
Didn't the original chap who'd bought it, didn't he, say that he was in favour of the community buying it out?
He did. And the community voted, something like 85% of people wanted to buy it out. And there were people wanting to return to the island who, all these islands are constantly under the threat of depopulation. So if you encourage people back, that's obviously what you want. They've just refused to get into dialogue. There was an offer, a price suggested by the owner a few years ago, which was just ridiculous. So what they're now looking to do is to actually try and get down a legal route that requires the owner to come to the table and behave reasonably with the rural community.
Well, let's hope that Alistair Allen, manages to get some movement on that, because it's obviously it is what's needed for the community over in Bernary. But looking to the future, it's going to be needed for other land projects where communities want to take over the land from a big estate owner or landowner who's there at the moment. So it's really important that there's legal backing to at least say to them, you've got to be in communication. You can't just ignore this. So, fingers crossed that that manages to come about. I go up to Lewis very occasionally, not as often as I'd like actually. It's to look after my friend's two collie dogs. So my friend goes off somewhere else for a break, and I'm up there in the cottage with the two dogs. And one of the places that I love up there is called Gallen Head, Aird. It's near Uig, right on the west coast of Lewis. So Aird is the village, and it used to be RAF Aird up on Gallen Head. Ministry of Defence land. Had been an RAF station, lookout point in the Second World War, and before that, and then latterly it was a radar station. And the community bought that out from the Ministry of Defence. So they own that now, and God, they've got a big project ahead of them to make something of it. I know they've got all sorts of plans. They've got a very nice cafe, folks. If you're up there, you can at least go to the cafe to help them out. So it's not as if these buyouts don't happen and can be successful. I mean, there's been a few of them, roundabout. There's Alba, Island of Alba. They've taken it over. We just need to make it a bit more streamlined for people.
Yeah.
So where the kind of underlying assumption becomes, this is the direction, this is the pathway we want to have open for communities like that. I mean, we happen to be talking about the Isles, but actually it could be in cities and towns with people wanting to take over derelict land. So
it doesn't have to be derelict either. I mean, the great statistic that I came across was in the economics thing we were at, is that we know that most of Scotland's rural land is in private hands, and very, very few private hands at that. But more than 75% of people in the Western Isles today live on community-owned land, which is a huge statistic. I had no idea it was anything like that much. Yeah. And we often bemoan in our shows the fact that Scotland, we don't seem to own anything. Our ports, our infrastructure, our institutions are foreign owned, and all the profits are flowing out of Scotland, which again was something that Ross Greer had made that point, that Flamingo Land, the profits end up in Yorkshire. Yeah. So, the idea that we can buy back Scotland a little bit at a time. I mean, I think the idea, I'm quite tempted to try and crowdfund buying Clackmannanshire. Why shouldn't we try it?
But it's interesting, because look at that statistic, like 75% now. I would put money on that a large part of that was down to the move that Lord Lever made to hand over his estates on Lewis into the hands of the Crofters. So that was great, and it was a big move, and that, I'm sure that will be part of the reason there's a high percentage up there. But look what it took. It took a guy who had a bit of a different viewpoint and was willing to make that state, but it was in his power to be able to do that. So, what we want to be in a country where, where the assumption is that if a community seriously are wanting to do that, I mean, obviously a community's got to prove itself to be serious in taking a buyout. It is hard work. It takes a lot of skill and stamina to do it. But surely we want to be where, the underlying assumption is that is what will happen. It will take time and everything, but that's where people's energy can be challenged and supported. Not a country where, it can happen sometimes if there's a bit of magnanimity on the local landowner and he says, okay, you can have it. And even local landowners who are quite, have got some good ideas and are running their land well, it's still a great chunk of Scotland in the hands of one person. I mean, let's move away from that.
Yeah, and that, as we can see with Bernera, you might have a great benevolent landlord. Doesn't mean when he dies that the next one is going to be
exactly. Yes, exactly. Well, so it's obvious, for those of you listening to me and Fiona here, it's obvious what we want to happen.
Yeah, crowdfund. Let's get Clackmannanshire back into Scottish hands.
Ross Greer, I think Ross Greer's done a really good job with the Flamingo Land one. So let's hope he's successful.
Yeah, and Dr. Alistair Allen as well as
yes, indeed.
Yeah, and I mean the thing, the weekends that we spent at the Scotonomics Festival of Economics, one of the topics of discussion was around the need for local democracy and sort of European style local democracy is the kind of thing we're seeing on these islands. That's about the size of it. Yeah. And they're not doing it full time. They're certainly not paid for it, but my goodness, they absolutely care about it because it affects them and their community and how they live. And the stake that they've got in their own community is huge. So it just seems no-brainer that's the way we would want to go.
So maybe that's if we should maybe have another look at that footage that from the Scotonomics Festival, and maybe we can do another little episode of these minis. I haven't quite got my tongue around it yet, but anyway, when we do another short podcast on those, that was good as well.
Yeah, great. Okay, so thanks for listening, and don't forget, new episode of our podcast out every Friday, and don't forget to have a look at our IndiePod Extra YouTube channel, where you'll get little things like this that aren't available on.
Yes,
internet. Just cute.
you've been listening to History in the Making. This is the first episode of Maybe's Minis. We need a jingle. We'll have a jingle by the time you get back to the next one.
We'll have a jingle and a logo by next time.
Bye then, everyone.